Well, hello, everybody. This is Jennifer McIntyre at United Fresh. I am joined by Ken Peterson from USDA's Ag Marketing Service and Rebecca Anderson with Global Gap. And today we've got our webinar, the first of two in a series, the Harmonized Standard, Myths, Legends, and its Growing Role in the Marketplace. So I'll start with a couple of logistics. The phone lines are muted. The way that you can submit questions is in the chat box, which is on the left-hand side of the screen. And this session is being recorded, so you can listen to it at your leisure. The objectives of this webinar are to gain an understanding of how the Harmonized was developed. Some of the organizational structure, we get a lot of questions about the relationship between United Fresh, its role in the Harmonized, USDA, AMS, and Global Gap, relationship with GFSI, relationship with the Produce Safety Rule. And I do want to spend some time talking about the future of the Harmonized because as the situation has evolved, there are some real opportunities, I think, to educate and promote the Harmonized because it does fit many, many needs. And then we will have some time for questions. So a little bit of background on the Harmonized. It's been nearly a decade since a group got together and realized that as you looked across various GAP audits, that they were, for all intents and purposes, pretty darn similar, and that there was a real opportunity for harmonization. Where they seemed to stray is that in the non-food safety issues, so some of the social issues, environmental issues, this is where there were differences from audit to audit. But when it came to the core of food safety, there was a lot of similarity. So stakeholders were brought together. United had gone through this process before with tomatoes and the tomato metrics and guidelines. In the western states, leafy greens had developed this model really for building consensus on general GAP standards. Leafy greens, tomatoes, at that time they were commodity specific, and it was felt that there was an opportunity to look at general GAPs that would be applicable across all commodities, all scale in terms of size, and develop ultimately a harmonized standard. So the process was really reflective of tremendous representation and participation from the entirety of the fresh produce supply chain. So there was a small but influential steering committee, those representing suppliers, distributors, retail and food service, that we recognize often drive the decisions around what their suppliers, what their growers are going to adhere to in terms of food safety requirements. The next slide is just kind of an illustration of the types of companies that were represented here in the steering committee. So it was a lot of the big names, those that do have their fair share of the market, that were able to help drive this process. Really, the vision of harmonization was to have one audit that would be acceptable to all buyers. Again, this was nearly a decade ago, and as I say that now, it probably sounds pretty familiar for those of you who are acquainted with GFSI and the objective of GFSI, to have something so you didn't have audit fatigue, so that you could have that one audit, it covered all the bases, and it satisfied all of your customers, all of the buyers. The way the Harmonized Standard was developed or compiled was by bringing together a very broad group of stakeholders, customers, suppliers, government officials, those audit companies that were already out there, various associations, across the range of commodities, range of sizes, and including Mexico and Canada. Although United Fresh facilitated this process, you didn't have to be a United Fresh member to participate, and that is the case even today, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So open invitation for participation, no stakeholder was or is excluded. That said, you have 150 people. There often, in my experience, tends to emerge a core group of individuals, and there were about an awful lot, about 50 here, This is their affiliations at the time, but this was that core group who really worked to fine-tune the standard. And the way they did that was by looking at a variety of existing standards. So the California LGMAs, mushroom gap, looking even outside the U.S., looking at government, private, commodity-specific. So across the board and seeing what did they have in common. And it was my understanding from Dave Gombis and others who participated is that it was quite a process to look at those 13 standards. The group identified 60 common audit categories, really worked on the wording, seeing what were the common concepts, what was the common wording, and over the course of 5 meetings, drafted that first draft of the Harmonized standard. And then it went through, wording, formatting, and testing. So doing pilot audits, again, looking at different parts of the United States, different types of commodities, different sizes of growers, field-grown, field-packed greenhouse. So trying to get as rigorous a test as possible to make sure that the Harmonized would work for these variety of different needs. If you haven't seen what it looks like, this is the format of the Harmonized. So this was the standard as it was completed in July 2011. There is a requirement, then there's a procedure. The verification is what an auditor would use, and then a corrective action if that requirement and procedure are not satisfactory. It's broken into various sections, so it's organized currently this 1.1, 1.1.1, the general questions, management responsibility, and then all of those types of characteristics, those attributes are covered under that header. And it goes on and on for many pages, and you can freely download it at the United Fresh website. So who owns the standard? I'll do my best to explain, and I'll acknowledge that being here at United for about 2 years, it probably took me almost a year to try to figure out how this structure worked. So United Fresh is the secretariat for the standard. We are responsible for facilitating the process to develop policies. We're responsible for maintenance of the standard. Coordination of the support committees, so the technical working group, and then another very active group, the calibration committee, that I'll talk about in a moment. We have a web page. We've worked over the past several months to really enhance and augment the information available on that web page. It's from our main page, unitedfresh.org. It's the food safety tab on the left side. It is one of the priority issues. So the Harmonized Standard, the Global Harmonization Initiative is right there as a priority. And from there, you can find the frequently asked questions. We are a point of contact for questions, although I know USDA AMS fields a lot of questions, Global Gap fields a lot of questions, and so we do work together through the Calibration Committee. The larger group is that technical working group. So that list of what was 150 with about 50 or so very active individuals is still in existence, and that membership will remain open. One of the things that I want to impress upon you today, if you're listening to this webinar and you're interested, please consider joining the technical working group. We have a new call for volunteers. We have a renewed commitment from those who have previously served. And so if you are interested, the group meets face-to-face no more than once a year, or at least over the past several years, no more than once a year. And as you know, maybe a phone call, an email here or there. But this is a very important group to us moving forward, and I'll explain why in a moment as we look at the future of the Harmonized. So contact myself, contact Erin, and we can point you in the direction of volunteering for the technical working group. As I noted, you can find copies of the Harmonized freely accessible on the United Fresh website. What we do is provide a license to audit organizations, USDA, AMS, Global Gap being 2, but not the only 2. And on the website, you can also find those other audit organizations that are licensed to use the standard. We do require that the standard be used verbatim, so no changes in wording. You can change the order of questions, but no changes in wording. So when you're looking at the technical standard as offered by AMS, when you're looking at the technical standard as offered by Global Gap, the core harmonized standard is identical in terms of the wording. From time to time, because this is kind of a risk-based standard, there are some areas where there are questions around interpretation. And these questions are addressed by a calibration committee. Any changes in wording, any new requirements, those are handled by that larger technical working group. And we have a process to do that, and that's part of why we're looking for new volunteers. A decision was made very early on that United Fresh would manage the audit standard, the technical, what I'll call the food safety components of the standard, that we would not manage the audit process. We would not dictate, specify, or have any control over the audit process. So each of the licensees issues their own certificates. United does not issue certificates. We don't manage the certificate process in any way. Each licensee has their own compliance criteria or evaluation criteria that results in the issuance of that certificate. We don't have any influence or any say or any interest in doing that. We don't set fees in terms of what the audit costs or anything like that. So the audit process is up to those licensees. The technical food safety audit standard, that is where United has a role in facilitating the work of the technical working group. The calibration committee that I've briefly mentioned is a subset of the technical working group. We require that each licensee, each audit organization, does have one representative who serves on the calibration committee, and it's supplemented by subject matter experts. What this group is responsible for, and they meet more frequently than the technical working group, between every month to every quarter, depending on the issues. But they're the ones who help address these interpretation issues. They're the ones who ensure that there's calibration in how the standard is being interpreted and how it's being applied. So sometimes there are emails where there's a real-time need for a judgment on a particular issue. They also help develop the official auditor training materials. And those are the individuals who are also authorized to conduct training to the Harmonized. If there are issues, so if you are either an auditor or you're the auditee, and there's some disagreement around the interpretation of the standard, we ask that individuals first go to that audit organization. That should be the first line to resolve any issues. If an agreement cannot be reached, that's when the audit organization would come as a member of the calibration committee. They would bring this to the larger calibration committee, and the decision would be reached by consensus of the committee. One of the things that I would like to do is really start to track what are these issues that commonly occur. Where are there these issues where there is this subjectivity, there is this difference in interpretation, and the calibration committee has already offered several areas where there just seems to be a need for more information. So we will be developing more frequently asked questions, maybe some guidance documents, things like that, where we see a recurrence in terms of topics that the calibration committee is being asked to address. When there are opportunities or needs to update the standard itself, this is the job of the technical working group. So recommendations can be submitted to us. The technical working group and calibration committee work together to identify and propose new language, but any changes are published on the United Fresh website. We try to push out as much as possible notification to stakeholders that changes are being proposed and give everyone an opportunity to comment before these are finalized. Now, most recently, this happened right as I was joining United in July of 2016. And it occurred because, for several reasons, but primarily because the produce safety rule had been finalized. Now, the Harmonized covers more commodities and more sizes of entities than the produce safety rule does. So there was a balance to be struck in terms of making sure that the Harmonized was still relevant and applicable for those non-covered commodities and for those who might be exempt. We also wanted to make sure that if there was anything that was in the produce safety rule that wasn't covered in the Harmonized, that we closed any of those loops. So the group came together in July of 2016. The red line was published online for public comment. Those comments were evaluated, and the final was posted in January of 2017. We had taken the red line off, and then there were many requests to continue to see what had changed, so we've put them back up so you can see those. If you are interested in really understanding where those changes occurred, tune in tomorrow. That's the webinar at 2 o'clock Eastern Time where we'll be going through. It's a little more of a training rather than an informational webinar tomorrow. Ken, I know that you're on the line. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about USDA and the HGAP and HGAP Plus and how what USDA's role in the Harmonized is and what your role with United is.
Certainly. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. So as Jennifer mentioned, we here at USDA Ag Marketing Service are one of the signatories to use the Harmonized GAP standard. And we have been offering audits against the Harmonized GAP standards since 2012. So as we've been offering audits since that time, and as things happened within the industry, and obviously FSMA came out, and the rule became final. We worked very closely with United Fresh through this technical working group to update the Harmonized standard to ensure that the components of the produce safety rule were incorporated in the Harmonized standard. The other thing that we have done as a sister government agency to the FDA is we worked very closely on a GAPS alignment project of the USDA GAPS program to the FSMA produce safety rule, which resulted in an announcement back in early June of this year that FDA acknowledged that the USDA Harmonized GAP program is aligned with at least the minimum technical requirements of the produce safety rule. And again, that was done over about an 18-month period. We sat down with FDA staff from CIFSAN and the produce safety team and really went through the Harmonized standard and the produce safety rule almost line by line, looking to see what needed to be done. Now, one thing I do want to point out here is that the Harmonized standard, because it's a market access audit primarily, as we went through the harmonization, way back in 2010, 2011, the Harmonized standard in many cases is already at or above what the requirements of FSMA produce safety rule are. So quite honestly, we didn't have a whole lot of things that we needed to do because of the work of the technical working group and everything. But what we ended up doing is we've got our version of the Harmonized standard. Again, it's the Harmonized standard language verbatim as written, as was mentioned earlier. But what we did is we rearranged the order of the questions. We just felt for the audit flow and the audit process that we needed to reorganize some of the order of the questions so that the process flowed better and we kind of grouped similar types of questions together. The other thing that we did is we updated our compliance criteria, again, as part of of that alignment with FSMA. So while the acceptance criteria is generally the same as we've used in previous years, it has been updated, and we think we've actually streamlined it so that it's easier to understand and know what is necessary in order to achieve a USDA certification for the Harmonized GAP audit. The other kind of major piece that we've been working on is GFSI technical equivalency. So as many of you are aware, if you're a producer, is that many buyers are increasingly requiring an audit against one of the GFSI benchmark certification programs. So we have been working with GFSI for a number of years now on a pathway that would allow AMS to gain some sort of a recognition by GFSI. In March of 2017, GFSI came out with a new program called Technical Equivalency for Government-Based Certification Programs. And it's similar, but not identical to benchmarking like one of the existing certification program owners, such as Global Gap, go through. Technical equivalency just looks at the food safety elements within GFSI's benchmarking document and doesn't get into the whole management side and service delivery side of it. So, it's, like I said, it's similar. The technical components are equivalent to what GFSI requires, but it doesn't get into all the other elements that the certification programs go through, because our audit processes as a government entity are slightly different in the way that we do things within a government program. So we submitted an application for technical equivalency back in January and are going through the technical equivalency process, and we are painfully close to hearing back from GFSI on whether or not we've achieved technical equivalency. So please stay tuned to that. But we are working through that process, which ultimately will, in many cases, allow producers to use the Harmonized GAP Plus audit to satisfy buyer requirements. So with that, I will turn it back over to Jen.
Thanks, Ken. And United Fresh is certainly very supportive of USDA, AMS, or any other licensee pursuing the GFSI. In this case, it's technical equivalency or benchmarking. And I was hoping, Rebecca, that you could talk a little bit about your experience going through the GFSI process, because Global Gap was the first to achieve true benchmarking.
Sure, Jennifer. And again, I echo Ken and say thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. With Global Gap, we have started our second GFSI benchmarking process with GFSI. GFSI changes their technical requirements periodically, and so we're in the process of updating to version 7. And also, with the updated Harmonized standard, we are doing that again. So in the first round of GFSI, one of the challenges, I guess you would say, would be just having certificates issued for the Harmonized standard and waiting a year after the certificate is issued in order to even apply for the GFSI process, and having 10 certificates in order to keep going through the application process, as well as certification bodies that are using it. So there's a multitude of things that we have to do to show that the audit process and audit system works to achieve GFSI recognition. The other thing would be, in terms of equivalency, there are 10 additional questions that we have asked in order to achieve GFSI recognition that may or may not be scoped as food safety related. For example, we ask about complaints and food fraud, which are not in the Harmonized standards. And so those kinds of questions need to be asked in order to achieve GFSI recognition, as I'm sure Ken can quite understand. So I think that at this stage, we are, as I said, benchmarking our next version with GFSI, and that entails them reviewing the standard, coming to our offices, issuing non-compliances that we have to respond to. So the same kind of audit process that producers go through as well, except for just looking directly at the standard. And I think that this is extremely important to us as we have global recognition for our main IFA standard, and we want to make sure that we allow producers that use the Harmonized standard have access not just to the U.S. market, but to the global market as well. And this is one avenue to be able to do that. So that's kind of where we are now, the process that we went through, and I guess the update on GFSI as it relates to Global Gap.
Thanks, Rebecca. And, so one of the questions that we at United are asked is the Harmonized recognized by GFSI? So as, hopefully you've gathered, the answer is, well, yes, currently, if you get it through Global Gap, and yes, in the very near future, through USDA AMS, through the technical equivalency process. So there are other licensees, as I mentioned, who also are authorized to audit to the Harmonized. They have not gone through the GFSI benchmarking process, although we would encourage any of the licensees to do that if they wish. But part of what GFSI is evaluating is the audit process, which is unique to each licensee. So I think you can feel confident that from the technical food safety side, that the Harmonized is a robust standard, that some of the GFSI evaluation is on the process, which then is licensee by licensee. There are also buyer-specific riders. So Rebecca mentioned that for GFSI that there are a couple of topics that are not often considered core to food safety, food fraud, evaluations, complaints, a couple of others. And some buyers also have their own unique requirements from time to time. And so the Harmonized doesn't have the authority to limit riders. Of course, we want to see universal adoption of the Harmonized, and so things can stray when you start to have different bells and whistles that become attached, but there is a process to do that. If there really are areas where there's a deficiency in the core, the essence of the Harmonized that people feel that they need to have a rider for, well, really we would prefer that they bring that to the technical working group. And really we'd prefer that those buyers who are identifying deficiencies join the technical working group. If you are at the table, you are in a position to make the Harmonized more robust. And again, this is part of the reason that we have a renewed call for volunteers for the technical working group. So if you're a buyer and you feel like I'm not sure about the Harmonized, it lacks or it's weak in some areas, bring those suggestions to us. Be part of the process. So the current status, there are about 3,000 certificates per year and growing. So we see increased recognition of the Harmonized, increased acceptance, and increased desire for the Harmonized. As I mentioned, it covers operations that are producing produce that would be covered by the produce safety rule, as well as products that are not covered because they are rarely consumed raw. There's a perception, I think, that the Harmonized is really targeted toward smaller growers. And that certainly wasn't the intent. It may have found appeal with smaller growers because it is focused on those core food safety areas and doesn't have some of the other elements that are more, I'd say, optional. So it's not that the Harmonized is easy, it's that it's focused. We have worked much more closely through the calibration committee and with licensees to find areas where we need to provide, as a community, increased explanation about certain areas, certain requirements of the Harmonized. I, in January, went to our board of directors at United Fresh and asked for the board's opinion on what the future of the Harmonized should be and what United's role should be in it. and got very clear direction from our board that the Harmonized is important to the community, even outside, and in particular maybe outside of the United Fresh membership, but really important to the community. And so I have direction from our board to continue to support and really to increase support of the Harmonized. Right now, honestly, there has been some limited training opportunities available through United. We had one last summer, right around this time, but we as United haven't had one since. Some of the licensees have, and we've asked them to let us know when they're offering a training and if it's a public training so that we can put those and promote those on the website. But we see that there is a need to have more training around the Harmonized. We also, the frequently asked questions just went up a couple months ago. We don't have a whole lot of additional guidance. USDA does, some others do, and so the calibration committee with those representatives from those licensees are coming together to kind of compile resources and make sure that they're, first of all, consistent with each other, that there is this calibration, and that they're widely disseminated. And United will take a leading role in pushing those materials out and making sure that growers feel very comfortable with the Harmonized and that the auditors are equipped as well. There are a number of buyers who already are accepting of the Harmonized, and we see this list growing, and we see, again, increased recognition, especially due to factors such as that alignment, that recognition by FDA, the interplay with GFSI. So there are a lot of, I think, forces working in favor of the Harmonized, and that has been recognized throughout the buying community. Some have maybe some additional conditions, but there is a lot of support from the buying side. And if your company is not on this list and you support the Harmonized and you want to be on the list, let us know. If your company is not on the list because, again, you have questions, you're not quite sure, we would absolutely invite you to become part of the process. So in the future, one of the things that we have not yet done is take that newer version, that update of the Harmonized that is aligned with where we did the alignment with the produce safety rule. It has not been translated into Spanish. The original Harmonized was, and that is still available from the website, but clearly at this time it's a little bit out of date. We are extremely fortunate to have some members and colleagues who are willing to do that translation, so that is underway as of the other day. I've noted several times, I've encouraged you several times to join the technical working group if you're not already on it, because we have gotten feedback from a couple of other groups, notably the group working on the tomato guidelines, who in looking to streamline the tomato metrics did find some gaps in the Harmonized and do have some suggestions of areas where they think new questions should be added to the Harmonized. So the technical working group is going to need to relaunch, become revitalized to assess these suggestions. Rebecca mentioned a couple of the elements of GFSI, some of the topics that are addressed there that are not currently addressed in the Harmonized. And when our Food Safety and Technology Council met a couple of weeks ago, we asked, should the Harmonized be reflective of all of the topics that are covered through GFSI? And we'll defer to the technical working group in making that decision. One of the first areas I think where I've gotten feedback that there's a lack of clarity or a lack of direction is how to conduct water quality risk assessment. So we're in the process right now, working as a joint effort between the United Food Safety and Technology Council and the Calibration Committee to put together some quick and easy documents and guidance on that topic, and more to come. We're also in discussions with other commodity groups who realize that the Harmonized, especially working with USDA AMS and looking at the government auditors who are doing some of these commodity-specific audits, if they are successful in the technical equivalency process, is there an opportunity to leverage that? So there's a lot of interest in how the Harmonized can evolve. So I think to summarize, the reputation as a small grower, scaled down audit has really evolved. This is a robust food safety standard. It's gotten the alignment, the recognition with the produce safety rule that's looking at the USDA process overlaid with the technical standard. And then GFSI. Global Gap has attained the benchmarking, and AMS is in the process of getting technical equivalency. We at United have a renewed investment to provide these updates, to offer training, and we will support the licensees, and the licensees have offered additional support to United to create these new materials and to put the training out there. And so my question to the buyers on the phone is, what would it take for you to accept the Harmonized? What is the view, what is the perception of the Harmonized, and how do you want to contribute to the process to reduce audit fatigue while still ensuring that there are robust systems in place to manage food safety? I draw your attention to our website. I mentioned it. It's under the Food Safety tab on the left-hand side. The green, it's extremely tiny, but the green tab about halfway down. And then it's a priority issue and the gap harmonization. You can see that we've got a laundry list of options there, the standards themselves, any upcoming training that we are either offering or aware of, and then those frequently asked questions. With that, I see that we already have a couple of questions that have come in, and I will, one of them I can easily answer is, will the slides be available? Yes, so this is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording. Aaron Grether on our team can also take this deck, convert it to a PDF, and put it there on the website that I just showed as one of the resources to support the Harmonized. So you can have access to a PDF of this deck and reach out to us anytime with questions. Rebecca, at this time, would you be willing to go through some of the questions that we've received? And if you're listening, you can type in your question on that chat box on the left-hand side.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. I think we answered some of the questions as we went through, but I'll just go ahead and put them out there. And Ken, if you're available, if you want to unmute, because some of them I'll toss to you. One of the questions was quasi-answered. It said, how widely is the system used in the industry compared to other GFSI recognized schemes? And I know that you mentioned we have over 3,000 certificates per year, but how does that compare to the other schemes? And maybe I can answer first and say that in the U.S., it is a growing number of certificates that we are getting compared to the normal IFA scheme. So it would be somewhere probably around 10% of our certificates in the U.S. and then also growing. And the global market, it is not so big compared to the amount of certificates that we and producers we have worldwide, but it is 10%, and we hope to see that number increase as producers become more familiar with GAP standards and, of course, get prepared for FSMA. I don't know if you have any other answers on comparative certificates. Jennifer or Ken?
This is Jennifer, and certainly I realize that there are other options that are out there, some of which do have GFSI recognition, but I don't know the scale. That's not information that I've either hunted down or that has been shared with me. But I do anticipate that for numerous factors that we've reviewed in this webinar, that the Harmonized will take an even greater role, and appreciate, Rebecca, that Global Gap went through the process to get that recognition. Ken, that AMS is going through the technical equivalency process, and so I think that others will follow. And as I said, United is very happy to support those efforts.
Great, perfect. Okay, the next question is probably one for me as well. FDA acknowledged the alignment with the USDA AMS HGAP and the produce safety rule. Does this mean that by default, the regular or non-USDA harmonized standard and the Global Gap HBSS are aligned as well? So I'll answer by saying that when a licensee uses the Harmonized standard verbatim, we would by default be aligned. As far as the Global Gap HPSS, I can say that we have not had the same type of communication that USDA has, and we are working with FDA to look at private standards, but they would look at GFSI as a whole first. So I don't know that they'll come out and say alignment the way that they did with USDA, but since we do use the standards verbatim, I can't imagine why they would not have the same, how do you say, technical equivalence. Would you have anything to add to that, Ken?
Certainly, we went through the process with FDA as a sister government agency, and FDA committed to working with us on that. But as I mentioned previously, we collectively worked very closely with the technical working group to make those changes to the standard back in 2016. So while FDA has not acknowledged the Harmonized standard as a solo standalone unit, you can kind of infer, if we're using the same standard, that you're meeting the elements of the produce safety rule. It's just that FDA has not formally acknowledged that.
I think that officially answers that question. Perfect. Okay. Ken, this is also for you. Where is Walmart at this point with accepting the Harmonized standard if it gets technical equivalency? So I know that for us, Walmart has said that the GFSI recognition is fine. Will technical equivalency give you that same level of acceptance?
So we are actively talking with Walmart on this. And quite honestly, I don't yet know the answer from Walmart. They certainly have recognized at least the USDA version of the Harmonized standard up to this point within their local supplier program. But I don't know where they are at yet as far as accepting it for for other suppliers that are not part of that kind of local supplier program. But more to come on that once we achieve technical equivalency. And I can talk to Walmart more definitively. Until I hear back from GFSI, it's kind of hard to have that conversation.
Understood. Perfect. Another question. How different is this standard compared to a Primus audit?
Well, I would invite you, Rebecca and Ken, also to chime in on this. But my understanding is that when the process of harmonization was undertaken, that all of the major audit organizations were invited to the table to help contribute. I don't believe that Primus took advantage of that opportunity, and so I'm not sure the extent to which, and I don't know how their standard has evolved, quite frankly, over the past 9 years or so. I do get a lot of questions from members about Primus audits, and so from time to time I hear some of the elements that are asked in the Primus audits. The questions generally are those that don't pertain to food safety. They're kind of above and beyond other tangential things. So I myself have not seen a Primus audit, so I can't do a side-by-side comparison to discuss how they line up against the Harmonized.
Yeah, I'll take that question back. That's fine. I appreciate your telling the history about Primus's involvement in the Harmonized gap. I didn't actually know that because this was developed before I came into this realm too. But I can tell you now, as someone who's been a scheme manager working on the different standards, so looking at Global Gap, looking at Harmonized, and looking at Primus, auditing them, and also training other auditors, I'm obviously out of that game, and Primus is technically a competitor now, so I just want to make sure that caveat is out there. But the first difference is obviously the audit process in terms of scoring and the obtaining the certificate itself. For example, the Harmonized, as Jennifer said, does not include the audit process. That's up to Global Gap. That would be up to USDA, et cetera, any licensee of the standard. So, for example, the standard itself does not contain auto failures the same way that a Primus GFS audit would, but maybe there's a different way of handling each situation with USDA or with Global Gap. In terms of the content itself, one of the main differences is the flexibility that the Harmonized standard allows in terms of industry best practices or requiring the producers to come up with the procedures themselves based upon their risk assessment. So the standard is heavily reliant upon risk assessments and making sure that producers understand what hazards occur on their farm and how that pertains to their risk, and making procedures based on that. Versus the Primus standard itself would be more explicit on the instructions or procedures that are required, as well as the daily checklist that the producers need to have on hand. So it's just more prescriptive, which poses its own challenges in terms of preparedness and whether something is applicable to a farm or not. So I think those are the main differences. In terms of actual food safety coverage, I don't think that there's anything that's significantly different between any of the standards, to be honest. Hopefully that answers that question. If anyone had anything to add or need clarity, maybe I can answer.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I see that there's a kind of related question of will this new standard, and the Harmonized was updated, completed about a year and a half ago, so it's not like a brand new standard. I think it's pretty well established, but would it be a good substitute to Primus audits? And I think that's up to each producer to evaluate. So the Harmonized, the full Harmonized standards are available on the United Fresh website, so you can take a look at what the requirements are and judge for yourself if you think that it's appropriate, suitable for your operation. It certainly was developed to be suitable for any type of operation.
Yeah.
Ken, can I ask you a quick question, kind of a rephrasing of a question that I see that was submitted? At the point that USDA does attain technical equivalency with GFSI, will there be a non-GFSI option offered by AMS that is based on the Harmonized?
Yes. So we've actually will have two different audits. So we'll have the Harmonized audit, which is verbatim the Harmonized standards on the United Fresh website. We've reordered the ordering of the questions, but it's the same exact audit that's on the United Fresh website. We also will offer the Harmonized Gap Plus or HGAP Plus audit, which it will be, or what we submitted to GFSI for technical equivalency. So similar to what Rebecca mentioned that Global Gap went through, where they needed to add some additional questions in order to fully comply with the GFSI requirements, food fraud, some other areas, food defense, things like that aren't covered by the Harmonized standard. We added those to the Harmonized Gap Plus, so hence its name, in order to try and achieve technical equivalency. So that kind of a long answer is yes, there will be two separate Harmonized standards, one that's just the base, one that's the GFSI technical equivalent.
Thanks.
Perfect. We do have another question, but I'm not sure I understand it. What is the accreditation process? I think we've pretty well covered the GFSI accreditation process, so I'm going to mark that as answered.
And I would just add, Rebecca, that, as I mentioned earlier, United Fresh doesn't dictate any of the audit process. So any audit organization that's interested in using the Harmonized, whether they've gone through a separate accreditation or not, is able to use it. So it is up to the client, the producer, to select which type of auditor they want to be auditing them, and what the qualifications of that auditor, an audit company, should be. And that may be, accreditation may be part of that, but that is not something that United Fresh plays any type of a role in.
Okay, perfect. That helps a lot. I'm going to ask just a few questions or just give you a few comments because these are the questions that I frequently get. One of the questions would be, can this standard be used outside of the United States? And I know for us, we are seeing interest in Mexico and Latin America, particularly clients that would be exporting specifically to the U.S. I don't know if anyone else has heard of any experiences outside of the U.S., and I do think that there are a few people that are calling globally on this, so I just want to make sure that that's mentioned. And I would imagine, Jennifer, that you could echo that the standards, while they were built in the U.S., they are, built with SGMA in mind, but this food safety technical requirement should apply anywhere in the world, if I'm correct.
Right. So hazards have no passports. The food safety practices that are effective in the U.S. Or are the same as would be effective anywhere else. Again, it was written with that flexibility to accommodate for the variety of growing situations, the variety of commodities, the variety of sizes. So I see absolutely no reason that the Harmonized should be perceived to be limited to the United States. It's up to what buyers will accept, what the capacity is to audit to the Harmonized in other parts of the world, but that's something that if there's global interest, that we would certainly want to encourage and facilitate.
So this is Ken Peterson. We've actually audited to the Harmonized standard both in Canada and Chile at this preserve a buyer. So
perfect. Okay. On that note, so the standard includes things that say industry best practices. What exactly does that mean? So to elaborate, we talked about how the standard is flexible to industry regulations or current regulations, which is why it's so flexible and able to be used around the world. And also, we don't limit the products in terms of the commodity, fresh fruit and vegetable commodities that are limited. But frequently, it says industry practices or industry best practices. And I know for me that like the tomato metrics, for example, would be a reliable guideline to use for auditing through tomatoes. But what else can be identified as industry best practices?
That is a good question, and one of the members of the calibration committee, and I think you were willing to support this effort, Rebecca, is looking to compile those existing best practices so that there can be a reference list so that it's not terribly subjective. Because there are other commodity groups, regional groups who have put together very robust and sufficient, I think, best practices, commodity-specific, or of other scope that could be referred to. But we don't currently have like a list. So right now there may be a little bit of subjectivity around best practice, and this is where there are questions of interpretation, where the calibration committee, for right now, can help inform those questions also. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes. There was one more question that says, what what is the process or frequency that exists between the calibration team and audit teams to make sure that audits are consistent and auditors are calibrated? So I think one thing to say about this is that United Fresh, as the Secretariat, works to manage the calibration committee that meets intermittently, as well as communicates via email, which is one of the slides that we had mentioned. But we didn't talk about how that, when those issues get resolved, how does that get communicated out to the licensees?
Sure, and this is part of why each licensee needs to have a representative on the calibration committee, so that there is that direct connection with the licensee so that they can disseminate it, and it is their responsibility to disseminate it within their organization so that there is a very consistent application of the Harmonized. We also, as I said, as we see things kind of bubble up consistently, we will put together frequently asked questions so then the entire community can benefit from the discussions that the calibration committee have had.
Perfect. I think that answers that question pretty well. Great. Thank you. Just one more note on these. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to address the question of like different versions of the Harmonized. So I know Ken mentioned that there's the Harmonized that is in its pure form. Then there's the version that USDA AMS has worked on to comply with the GFSI to go through the technical equivalency process. It covers those additional questions that are those additional topics that are must be addressed according to GFSI, and Global Gap U2 have addressed those topics, although the wording of your questions may be different for those additional questions than what USDA AMS has put together, but it still covers the topics. I'll point out that there are additional licensees that are also offering the Harmonized. What I think is the most important thing to communicate is that the questions, as you go to the United Fresh website and you look at the Harmonized standard, those questions will be identical regardless of which licensee is auditing against the Harmonized. So whether GFSI or not, those questions will be identical. An audit may have some additional questions to comply with GFSI. Those from AMS may be different from Global Gap, but the core elements of the Harmonized are identical from licensee to licensee.
Yeah. I just want to echo on the GFSI differences that I've also looked at the USDA Plus, and in terms of if we are that different, it's not even really a question on that either. So we added the things about food fraud and food defense and logo use, for example, the same exact question, just asked differently, and in terms of how it's used in USDA, for example. So our questions about logo would be using the Global Gap logo, and then USDA would ask questions about how product is labeled in terms of USDA. So those are the other types of questions that are on there. Other things would be like mass balance and making sure that you have certified and non-certified products, et cetera, things like that that don't really relate back to the food safety core questions that Jennifer mentioned. So in terms of the actual content, it shouldn't be perceived that these are that different in any way in terms of if I'm a buyer and what am I looking for, or if I'm a producer, making sure that all of my bases are covered. Hopefully we make it clear that even though there's different terminology for Global Gap and for USDA, that essentially it's the same thing. With that, I think that should be the last question. I think one thing I want to mention is our next training is coming up in October, and we'll send that information over to United Fresh as soon as the registration is available so that people can at least have a glimpse of the standard and scenarios and how it's carried out. If United Fresh or Ken, you have any last comments, I would open that back up to you to do now.
Thanks, Rebecca. I'll just note, I should have added on this last slide the information about tomorrow's webinar. Tomorrow's webinar will be very different in scope. It'll go kind of line by line over what those changes to the Harmonized are. Rebecca will be conducting some of the training, as well as another member of the Calibration Committee, Trish Tripp. And so if you are interested in seeing those changes, if you're already familiar with the Harmonized and you just want to have those changes highlighted, feel free to participate tomorrow. Same time, same phone number, different web link. So if you don't have it, contact, I think Erin Grether is probably the best person to contact at United Fresh to register, or you can find it on the United Fresh website. So I want to thank everybody for participating today. Ken, is there anything that you would like to say?
No, just thank you to everybody for participating in the call. It's great to see such a large number of people interested in the Harmonized standard and everything that we're doing as part of the GAPS Harmonization Initiative, and thank you very much.
Hey, Jen, if I could add one thing.
Oh, sure.
I can put the link to register in the chat function quickly.
Oh, perfect,
before we
Erin,
close out
thank you.
here. So if anyone's looking for that link, it'll be in the chat function. I'll go ahead and do that before we close.
Okay, great. Well, again, thank you everyone for attending the Produce GAPS Harmonization Initiative Introductory Myths and Questions webinar, and we will see you tomorrow.